Network segmentation. The most important aspect of network design is segmentation. Many companies fund costly upgrades when proper segmentation is all that was really needed. In this nugget, we're going to talk about the benefits, generally speaking, of network segmentation. Then we're going to get into the specific benefits associated with using a bridge, then a router, and then a switch, followed by a look at logical segmentation. You accomplish logical segmentation by using VLANs or virtual LANs. After that, we're going to look at the latency associated with each of these devices, the bridge, the router, and the switch. And we're going to end up with a talk about security, again with these three devices, the bridge, the router, and the switch. The benefits that are associated with segmentation are countless, but we're going to highlight a few of them. The first one we're going to look at is network extension. As with any network, there are limitations on the distance that those runs can be made from the central device. Let's take 10 base T, for example. Each of these N nodes has to be within 100 meters of that shared device. So what happens if we have an N5 here, 110 meters away? We have to extend that LAN, and that can be accomplished by inserting a device here. This can be a bridge, a router, or a switch to make that run. In fact, we can daisy chain these devices to an extent that we make our LAN much bigger. Remember, in the early days of networking, the problem was we had relatively small networks because these devices weren't available for extension. Next thing we need to look at, they reduce contention. What does that mean? All right, we have a shared media here for N1 and N2 to use. Only one can use that media at a time. Okay, it's a one-lane highway, and only one car is allowed on that highway at a time. The problem is, both of these could go at the same time for transmitting a packet, and then what happens? A collision. Pretty much like a wreck here in the middle. When that happens, each of these devices has to back off, and then there has to be retransmission that occurs. That's where we move into domain control. Instead of having a contention area that includes N1, N2, N3, N4, and N5, with this device in the middle, we have two contention areas, one for N1 and N2, and another for N3, N4, and N5, so that N3 can now transmit a packet at the exact same time that N1 does, and there are no problems. All right, so that's domain control. The two domains we need to be aware of. The first one we talked about was the collision domain. The next one that we're going to talk about is called a broadcast domain. BCAST for short. All right, what this deals with is when N1 sends a broadcast packet, in other words, it's addressed to everybody on the network, how far will it go? We're going to discuss this in more detail as the nugget goes along, but let me say in short, if this is a switch or a bridge, that broadcast will go across this, and broadcast from N1 will reach every device that you see here. If this is a router, it will stop right here. N2 will be the only one to see the broadcast. The router will not forward broadcast. All right, the next thing we're going to talk about, it isolates problems. All right, if I have a problem on N1, and this network card is jittering on the interface here and causing collisions and problems across the shared media, now with this segmentation in place here, N3, N4, and N5 are not affected by that problem. So that's a big concern. And last, security. Security can divide different departments. Let's say that I have an engineering department here, and I have an administrative pool here. I do not want my sensitive information that exists in engineering shared with administration, especially when it's just shared because of a broadcast being sent out of N1 and inadvertently getting to these devices. That can be controlled with segmentation, namely a router at this point. There are other security concerns that will be addressed by the use of access permissions being allowed through each of the devices, and we'll cover that in the last part of this nugget. These are the general benefits associated with segmentation. Now let's look at which of these benefits apply specifically when we use a bridge. All right, here we're going to have our example of a network without segmentation. In other words, we have one shared bus here, N1, N2, N3, and N4, all contend for the use of this shared area. Okay, now that contention is controlled by what is called CSMA CD. All right, this is what controls N1, N2, N3, and N4 from colliding, or at least helps them avoid collisions. Here we go. The first part is CS, carrier sense. The next is multiple access and then collision detection. The carrier sense speaks to the fact that N1, before it transmits a packet, is going to listen on the wire, and it's going to understand that when the wire is clear, I am available to go ahead and throw a packet out there. Multiple access obviously speaks to the fact that all of these devices can access that same shared media. And in collision detection says, after I transmit the packet as N1, I'm going to continue to listen. And if I hear a collision, then I'm going to let everybody know, and then we're all going to perform a backoff and retransmit as necessary. All right, that's pretty extensive. And as you get larger networks with many nodes, it can get pretty hairy. So what we do is we introduce a bridge in our network to cut down on those collisions and cut down on the contention. Now, we talked earlier about domains. So what we're really doing is taking one collision domain and dividing it into two separate collision domains. This means that N1 no longer has a bearing when it transmits on N3 and N4. They are completely unaware of the fact that N1 just transmitted, and in fact they don't need to understand that that has happened. We can see two of the bullets already addressed as far as general benefits of segmentation with a bridge. The first was reducing contention. Obviously we have 4 devices contending for the same area here. Here we've divided that, 2 on individual shared media. And then also we addressed domain control. Only half of it though. We did divide the collision domain into 2 distinct collision domains. But what about the broadcast domain? Again, the broadcast is N1 sending out a broadcast and it reaching every other device. With a bridge, it is going to be passed across there. So N1 will reach N2, N3, and N4 with broadcast traffic. Very important to keep that in mind. How about the other benefits? Network extension. Can I now add N5 here? I can, even though it had a greater distance from the shared media, the original shared media, let's say. But now we put in a bridge for extension, we can reach that N5. And the last one, isolation of problems. That will be achieved on every form of segmentation that we bring in, the bridge, the router, and the switch. Because if N1, again, is causing problems on this local area, it won't affect N3 and N4. At this point in our discussion, you should almost raise an eyebrow because you should be thinking, okay, I know a little bit about bridges. A bridge is a layer 2 device. And being a layer 2 device, we know that the physical layer is covered and the data link layer, both of these layers. Now we also know that these computers or end nodes are going to communicate at the data link layer via what's known as a physical address or a MAC address, okay? So when it broadcasts, N1 sends out a broadcast, it's going to do it at this layer, and the address it sends to is going to be a series of Fs, all right, as far as the broadcast MAC address goes. Now, if the bridge is aware of these addresses at this layer, why can't I filter anything that comes in with a destination address of all Fs? The answer is I probably could. I am aware of that as a bridge, but the default setting for a bridge is I will pass broadcast traffic. And you're just going to have to understand this as the way it is. All right, so I understand that it happens at layer 2 and a bridge is layer 2 aware, but it does not stop broadcast traffic. In fact, of the 3 devices that we're going to discuss today for segmentation, the bridge, the router, and the switch, only the router is going to stop broadcast traffic. It's the only one that, by definition, will stop a broadcast. So let's look at what we have here. First of all, we had a shared media environment with no segmentation. Then we introduced a bridge into this environment. And what we wound up with was 2 separate collision domains. Okay, but the broadcast domain was 1. Now let's introduce our router. As we introduce our router, we need to understand that it is a layer 3 device. So when we were talking about the layers earlier, we had the physical layer, we had the data link layer, and then we have above that the network layer. This is where we're operating with our router, which means that we are aware of not only physical addresses but logical addresses. Now, it is going to create, as understood before, 2 collision domains. All right, because those operate down here at these 2 layers. So it's obviously going to separate those 2. It separates the broadcast domain into 2 distinct broadcast domains from the network layer, even though the broadcast happened here. What else does it do? It offers the extension of the LAN, and it also isolates problems of the LAN. So it does everything that a bridge will do, plus it adds broadcast control. Let's draw an analogy here to make it a little bit clearer. I have a track team, and the first runner I have here is called collision. Okay? I have another runner, has a bit longer legs, and that is called broadcast. All right, as I'm running down this track, I have a couple of lanes. And there are no problem in an unsegmented network, they can go across the whole network. Now, as soon as I introduce a bridge, which is a layer 2 device, in other words, a hurdle, called a bridge, that is this tall, my collision can't clear that hurdle, and it stops right here. My broadcast can. All right? But if I introduce a hurdle, known as a router, this tall, again, my collision can't clear, and this time, neither can my broadcast. So it's as easy as that. We simply have a taller hurdle when we have a representation of a router for segmentation in our network. So when we're talking about differences in segmentation when we use a bridge versus a router, it's pretty apparent that there will be differences because they operate at different layers of the OSI model, and they have different characteristics associated with each. But how about when we compare a bridge to a switch? Will there be any differences? Because we know for sure that a bridge separates collision domains, 1, 2, and exists with one broadcast domain. In other words, N1 will hit N3 and 4 with a broadcast. These characteristics are the same on a switch. So where do we find the differences? All right, with a bridge, the processing of those frames is going to be done in software. Let's make a W out of that. With a switch, it's going to be done in hardware, which is much faster. That's one difference. The second is this. Let's talk about the backplane and how it operates. With a bridge, it operates in blocking mode. What does that mean to us? That means that as it's processing data from one port to another port, no other ports can be active on this backplane, which is why instead of connecting each of these nodes individually to a bridge, we normally see a local area network here, a local area network here, and then that network connected to the bridge, because one conversation can be taking place on this backplace at a time. It's right here. And so there's really no sense in having multiple ports because everybody else will just be waiting anyway. Now the switch operates in non-blocking mode, which means I can carry simultaneous data exchanges at the same time, which means that if N1 connects into the switch, it can transmit data to N4. At the same time, N2 can send packets across the backplane to N3. This is known as non-blocking. Now because we have that functionality in the switch, the port density automatically goes up because I can carry on multiple conversations. I might as well make use of that backbone, and you're going to see switches with higher port densities, normally 12 or 24 ports. So a switch can be drawn on your network design as one device like this, where the shared media is inside. It's this backplane, and it can operate multiple conversations, N1 to N3 and N4 to N2 simultaneously. The non-blocking backplane technology that we see here in a switch offered a major advancement for networking devices in the 1990s, and it was part of the reason for the boom of the switch at that time period. The other reason was logical segmentation. Logical segmentation is simply this. We spoke earlier that the switch and the bridge operated at layer 2. So we had the physical layer. On top of that, we had the data link layer. At this layer, the data link layer, is where we assigned addresses for broadcast transmission. And because we're aware of that broadcast transmission, we said, you know what, logically, we should be able to filter broadcast transmission at layer 2. Well, logical segmentation does exactly that. Where with a switch, the physical connections to each of these devices exist just like this. We have physical ports tied from the switch to each device, and we have a high port density because of the non-blocking backplane. We are able to segment these devices into local area networks, logical LANs. These are called virtual LANs or VLANs. All right, and so logically what this winds up looking like is a network hung off of one side of the switch for N1, N2, N3, and N4, and another network on the other side of the switch for N5, N6, and N7. Let me connect these two. Which means that a broadcast from N1 will reach N2, N3, and N4, but will not reach these ports. A broadcast from N5 will reach N6 and N7, but will not traverse across here. Okay? Furthermore, because we have these individual ports coming from the switch, each of these individual connections represents its own collision domain. So this is one collision domain. This is another. Because there is no possibility of these colliding on that physical connector, in other words, that cable, and once we get to the backplane, because I can support simultaneous connections, data exchanges, if you will, across this network, no collisions exist here either. All right, so that's pretty promising there, isn't it? So with our logical segmentation, or our VLANs, we're able to use a layer 2 device, the switch, and we can control the collision domain and the broadcast domain, as well as extend our network and isolate problems. Now let me take a step back and explain in a little bit more detail why collisions are not possible at this point here. We have a PC N4 connected via one cable directly to a port on the switch, so there are no other devices for N4 to contend with. Now you might say, well, N4 and the switch might contend with each other, and they won't, because in this direct connection there are rules, and it is this. If we're running at what is known as half duplex, then you can only transmit or receive. You can't do both simultaneously. Now, if the switch is transmitting a packet out, it blocks its receive here, and if this device, N4, is receiving a packet, it's going to block its transmit. So you can't have a collision because the devices won't allow, if it's receiving, to transmit out. And the same with the other one. If it's receiving, it won't transmit out. The other option is what's known as full duplex. And what they say there is, let's take advantage of the number of cables that we're dealing with. We have two pairs of cables. Why can't we transmit and receive at the same time? Because it's on separate, distinct cables. And that could happen either way. In either one of these options, no collisions are possible. The other major advantage of logical segmentation was the ability to logically group devices in a way that they seem like they are one broadcast domain, almost one local area network. Of course, this is logically because we see our physical connections up here. This is accomplished by what's called frame tagging. Now, frame tagging is very detailed, and it's beyond the scope of this specific nugget, but will be covered in a later nugget on VLAN specifically. So far in this nugget, we have looked at the benefits of segmentation. We've also looked specifically at which benefits are enabled by using a bridge, a router, a switch, and then the logical segmentation that's represented by VLANs. Next, we're going to look at latency. Now, this is going to be the latency that is involved with each individual device. First of all, let's look at the bridge. Operates at layer 2, which is physical, then data link. Okay, now it operates in software. We had said that in the last whiteboard. So it is a bit slower than its cousin, if you will, the switch that operates at the same layer 2, but does its computation in hardware. Then we move into segmentation with a router. Now, a router operates at layer 3. There's the physical, the data link, and then the network layer. What it buys you is control of our broadcast domains. Now, this control comes at a cost, though, because you have the associated latency with going up one more layer on the OSI model, and that's to the network layer. This is going to differ dependent on the speed of router you have, the port density of your router, and many other variables. But just know that it will be slower than the bridge or the switch, and the bridge will be slower than the switch. There are levels of security associated with each device as well. What we're going to see here to start off with, at our bridge, we have, again, a layer 2 device. So it can filter on anything that exists at this layer right here, specifically the data link, because at the physical layer, we don't have so much headers or trailers or any types of flags within the packets. Here we do at the data link layer. So we could filter based on a specific MAC address, specific multicast addresses, things of that sort. Same thing with the switch. We have no functionality above this layer, so the filtering of the security should be the same. Now, the way it's implemented may be different. The switch is more popular than the bridge, so you're going to have more commands designed within the iOS and things of that sort for the switches. In fact, bridges can run in the iOS because if you remember, you can turn your router into a router and have bridge functionality. But a switch is a dedicated, either the iOS or another operating system dedicated to the switch, so it will offer more functionality. Now, as far as security in reference to a router, we're able to filter based on not only data link information, but also the network layer information. So now I have more than specific devices that I can filter on. I also have an awareness of ports that are available on the transport layer above. So I can filter on ports as well. Okay, TCP or UDP or all of IP or some other protocol like IPX. Keep that in mind. So you might think, well, I also have logical segmentation that was completed by the switch. Here I'm able to stop broadcast, so can I afford the same security if I'm using the logical segmentation on a switch? And the answer is no, because it's still limited to this data link layer. It's all it can see. It does not go up further in the packet to have other flags to filter on, and the router does. So simply stated, bridge and switch, same forms of security. The implementation may be a bit different, and the router offers more security, but as we talked about in the last slide, at the cost of more latency. In this nugget, we saw how network extension, reduced contention, domain control, the isolation of problems, and security were general benefits associated with segmentation. Then we looked at the specific benefits associated with implementation of a bridge, then a router, and then a switch to segment our network. Logical segmentation is accomplished with VLANs. It's the ability to separate not only the collision domain, but also the broadcast domain with a layer 2 switch. Then we saw that the bridge and the switch offer less latency than a router simply because they only go up to layer 2 in their filtering, where the router will go up to layer 3. And the last discussion we had was on security, just the opposite. More benefit with the router because it does go to layer 3 versus the other two devices because they only cover layer 2, even in logical switching. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.